like households for our consumer price index, stationed all across the country. We have staff in Phoenix. I actually worked out in our Phoenix office for about 5 years. Never really got quite used to the heat, but I was actually out there last week too. We did a talk out in Phoenix to the Arizona State University Cronkite School of Journalism. So we deal with reporters as well, about 108, I think. So still, hopefully it'll be cooling off a bit for you guys in the future. But big picture is we have staff spread across the country to collect the data from businesses and households. And then, as I mentioned, there's a small staff of us here in the information office where we help disseminate the information to the public and answer questions that people may have about it. Big picture, BLS, you probably hear about us in the news. You may not know it always. The data you hear in the news, you might not know comes from BLS, but a lot of it does. Our most popular products include the Consumer Price Index, measuring inflation, and also our monthly jobs report. So our monthly jobs report comes out the first Friday of every month. It gives a kind of first look at what's going on in the economy from both the employment side, from the businesses, payroll side, as well as the household side, unemployment data. So it's national data comes out, state and local data come out 2 to 3 weeks later. So this first Friday of every month, the jobs report comes out, big picture. Gets a lot of headlines. You'll hear about it in the news, especially this time of year with every 4 years with election season. You'll hear our news and our data in the news even more, saying things like, "Oh well, you know, jobs have grown this much, inflation has gone up this much over the last time period." So lots of data out there. Our main numbers, as I said, the CPI, the jobs report. We also produce the employment cost index, which measures compensation costs from the employer's perspective. We're going to cover that today. Also, some other costs when it comes to business inflation, the producer price index, import-export price indexes as well. Those are what we call principal federal economic indicators. BLS produces 7 of the 33 principal federal economic indicators. And then just to wrap up with the agenda here, we're gonna drill down and look at, start with the national picture, then drill down to some local area data as well. Another great source of local area data, you may have dealt with your state labor market information office before, Arizona Office of Economic Opportunity. We work in conjunctions with the states to collect and publish a lot of this information. So a lot of the local information you will find on both our websites, the state website and the BLS website. Just starting off, here are some headlines. As I said, you probably hear about BLS a lot in the news, but you might not know it comes from BLS. Here are some headlines over the last couple of months that kind of talk about some of our headline numbers. You got the jobs report, you got job openings, our job openings and labor turnover survey. You have our headline about our CPI data. And then time permitting at the end, we're also going to talk about some of our employment projections. BLS does every year, they produce a 10-year employment projection to kind of see, what the labor market is expected to look like, projected to look like 10 years from now, whether that means, what occupations will see an increase in employment, what occupations might be declining based on things such as, automation and changing labor force demographics as well. Okay, so we're going to start with the big picture, talk a little bit about current economic trends, then kind of feed into how employers compensate their workers, how you might be able to use some of our data to stay competitive within the labor market when it comes to keeping and hiring and retaining workers. A little bit about how you can use BLS data, whether it's for contract negotiations or just getting an idea of the market rate for different occupations. And then, as I mentioned, time permitting, we'll take a little look into the future and see what BLS is projecting the labor force and labor market to look like over the next decade. So we're going to start with looking at some industry employment data. This comes as part of our monthly jobs report. It comes from businesses. So BLS surveys businesses to get this information, and this is where we get our total employment figures. So kind of technical, we call it total non-farm employment. This is our headline number. We do not capture farm workers in this particular survey. Department of Agriculture has great data, statistics on farm workers. This is looking at total non-farm employment. And as you can see, pandemic hit, lost 22 million jobs in the span of 2 months. Nationally, we have recovered since then, currently at about 159 million. total non-farm employment, that number was up 142,000 over the month and 1.5% over the year. One thing to keep in mind, some technical stuff about our headline number here. Once again, this is coming directly from surveys that we conduct with businesses. So it excludes self-employed people. And also, just a little caveat, people who have two jobs, multiple job holders, would be represented twice in these numbers because they would be popping up on both. If two companies were part of the survey, they would pop up on both of them. So just keep in mind, little caveats. We do have separate data that tracks self-employment as well as multiple job holders as well. So just keep that in mind. Big picture about, what are these industries? What industries make up the total non-farm employment? Largest industries, private education and health services, government, and professional and business services, followed by leisure and hospitality. Those are the kind of the industry sectors that make up that 159 million in employment. And each of those industries have kind of recovered a little bit differently coming out of the pandemic. We'll get into that in a bit. But just kind of start to drill down to below the national numbers. Nationally, employment up 1.5% over the year. Here's a map of state level data showing the over the year percent increase in employment by state. Once again, these are a little lagged because state data come out after the national numbers. So these are July numbers. But big picture, nationally, employment up 1.5%. In Arizona, up 2.3% over the year. Largest job gains over the year occurred in South Carolina, up 3.7%, Nevada up 3.3%. And just before I go too much further, Frank will be monitoring the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them anytime. I'd love to have a discussion. If you see something that looks interesting, more than happy to pause and go a little deeper into any particular topic that you might want to discuss further. So we saw that big picture, employment has recovered. It has been, trending up since the pandemic ended, but it has been slowing down. So this chart here shows the over the month gains in employment going back to early 2022. Coming out of the pandemic, we were seeing very big monthly job gains. February, you can see there in 2022, over 800,000 jobs added in 1 month. Has been trending down. So the economy is still adding jobs, but at a slower pace than it was 2 years ago. So the bars on the right there shows the annual average. 2022, the economy was adding 377,000 jobs per month. Last year, it went down to 251,000. And so far this year in 2024 has been adding 184,000 jobs per month. So I kind of like to show this because it can have an impact on wages when the economy is expanding, when lots of jobs are out there, companies are hiring. Workers tend to have a little bit more power. There are more opportunities to, there's lots of job openings in other places. I'll go move on to another job that might pay higher. So they have a little bit more leverage. As the labor market becomes tighter, job openings and hires kind of start decreasing. You can tend to see wages kind of decelerate a bit. Wage increases kind of decelerate a bit too, because there's less opportunities for workers to move on and find something else. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. As I mentioned, we had 142,000 jobs added last month, but it always helps to kind of dig a little bit deeper beyond those headline numbers and see, where are these jobs being added at? So this chart here shows the major industry sectors. Once again, this is a national level. Blue bars show the 1 month gain in employment, and the light gray bars show the previous 12-month average change. So over this last month, we saw the largest gains in private education and health services, which was mainly concentrated in healthcare, followed by leisure and hospitality and construction. And then we did see some job decreases over the month in industries such as manufacturing and retail trade. If we were to kind of pause and take a look back and say, what has happened? How has employment changed since prior to the pandemic? So a lot of people look at the month right before the pandemic started, which was February 2020, and kind of see what's changed since then. So as we showed on the first chart, total non-farm employment has recovered. It's 4.2% higher than it was prior to the pandemic. But some industries have had much, larger job growth since then. We saw huge job increases in the transportation and warehousing industry. It's still it still is currently 14.6% higher than it was prior to the pandemic. Big increases in construction as well. And we did see some smaller gains in industries such as manufacturing, retail, trade, leisure, and hospitality. Leisure and hospitality has regained all its jobs that were lost during the pandemic, 0.46% higher than it was in February 2020. But even within that sector, there's certain industries that have yet to gain back all the jobs lost. For example, food services and drinking places, which is a component of leisure and hospitality. Employment in that particular industry is much higher than it was prior to the pandemic, while the accommodation sector, your hotels, motels, employment in that industry has yet to recover. And that could be due to a variety of things. Definitely the travel was impacted during the pandemic, but also kind of just a shift in some of the practices of the accommodation sector. If you've been traveling to a hotel lately, you might have noticed maybe a little less often housekeeping services or more self check-in. So this might be a more permanent kind of shift in the structure of some of the jobs that are within that industry. Taking a closer look at total employment, total non-farm employment at both the state and local data. Chart on the left shows Arizona employment. Employment in Arizona, currently 3.26 million people employed. In Tucson, the chart on the right, 406,000 total employment. If we were to look at recovery since prior to the pandemic, since February 2020, the month before the pandemic, total employment in Arizona is 8.8% higher, while employment in Tucson is 2.8% higher. So both recovered. Arizona statewide has had larger job gains since prior to the pandemic compared to Tucson, but both have recovered nicely since the pandemic. We can also drill down and look at some of the detailed industries at the metropolitan area level. Just keep in mind when we say Tucson employment, the Tucson metro area, metropolitan area, the definitions there, one or more counties. In the case of the Tucson metro, it's just comprised of one county. So we need Tucson metro area, Pima County, they're interchangeable, same coverage area. So the chart on the left shows the 12-month percent change in employment in the Tucson metro area compared to the US. So employment has been increasing, so it's above zero. So on a monthly basis, employment has been increasing in both Tucson and the United States, but as you can see, been increasing at a slower rate. And in Tucson, employment has been increasing slightly lower than the United States average, but relatively close. On the right-hand side, you can see the percent change in employment by industry sector. So total non-farm employment over the year from May to May. I believe we have July data out. I forgot to update this chart here, but just to kind of show some of the level of detail we can get at the metropolitan area. And this chart is showing total non-farm up 1.3% over the year in Tucson, while some of the detailed sectors, leisure and hospitality, a little bit down over the year. Other sectors, manufacturing and construction, up over the year. So tons of data, tons of detailed data available on our website. If you're looking for employment within a particular industry in your area, feel free to reach out and I can get you that information. Or if you have any trouble finding it on our website, let us know. And then slowly starting to transition into some of the wage data. So the current employment statistics survey, the data that we were looking at, it tracks employment, but it also tracks average hourly earnings. So when we ask businesses to report data for this survey, we're getting data from them on their total employment and their total payroll. And with that information, and total hours worked. And with that information, we can determine average hourly earnings at the national level in this case. And you can see the red line is the over the year percent increase in the consumer price index. We'll touch a little bit more on that later, but that's basically inflation. So how much inflation is increasing over the year. We saw a huge spike in inflation in 2022. Inflation almost, got to about 9%. So that means that, from the consumer's perspective, their kind of cost of living, it was increasing at about 9% over the year. It still is increasing, 2.5%, 2.9% of July not seasonally adjusted. So it is still increasing a little bit faster than the Fed would like. They try to target it like a 2% inflation rate. But good news is it is, although it is increasing at a much slower pace than it was, a couple of years back, which is good news for workers. The blue line is the over the year percent increase in average hourly earnings. So I'll explain some of those spikes there in a bit, but if we just focus on the kind of last year's worth of data there on the right-hand side, we can see that average hourly earnings are currently increasing at a faster pace than inflation. So this means that workers' paychecks are going further, which is good news for workers. Going back to those big spikes and like the blue line there in 2020, that was due to the fact that the data we get, a lot of the lower paying industries were impacted by some of the shutdowns, so that a lot of lower paying occupations kind of fell off the payrolls for a couple months. So when you're looking at average hourly earnings for all the remaining workers, that skyrocketed up. So if you're going to be using this type of data for any sort of contract negotiations, I would not recommend using that spike there is not a good example of how much wages are increasing for individual workers. This is a big picture. Average hourly earnings for all workers on all payrolls increased due to that spike, due to the lower paying workers falling off the payrolls. When they came back on the payrolls, you see that big drop there as well. So those two are kind of anomalies, but took those out, you'd see more of a smooth line. And kind of the big picture is that there was a while there when inflation was outpacing earnings by a large margin, while the inflation is still going up. Now wages are currently increasing at a faster rate. So we're going to get into their employment cost index a little bit later, which I think is a much better, from an employer's perspective, is a much better way to track how wages are changing. But this is big picture data from our current employment statistics survey. You can also use the CES data to look at how average hourly earnings are changing by industry sector. So this is the latest data for August. The manufacturing sector had the largest over-the-year increase in average hourly earnings, 4.9%. Lowest were wholesale trade and retail trade, up 1.9% and 2.3%. So even though we saw overall wages are increasing at a faster rate than inflation, when we drill down to some of the detailed industries, you can see not all industries can have that same story. Some are increasing at a slower rate. Little side note, we also publish a little subset of this average hourly earnings, which specifically focus on average hourly earnings for production and non-supervisory employees. In general, we can see that average hourly earnings for production and non-supervisory employees have been tending to increase, have generally been increasing at least a faster, if not a little bit faster than all workers. So this often comes up, some of the lower paying occupations, production occupations, they've been seeing wage increase at a little bit faster rate than, say, some of the management positions and non-supervisory employees. So just something to keep in mind. And we can also drill down with our current employment statistics data and see how average hourly earnings are changing at the state and local level. Big picture here, Arizona, average hourly earnings up 4.7% over the year. That's the latest number on the far right, the red line there. And Tucson, average hourly earnings up 4.8% over the year. You can see they really spiked there for a bit, but still the 4.8% increase for Tucson. This is a pretty healthy increase in wages. And as I mentioned, we'll dive a little bit more into this and kind of show how some of these wage increases compare historically with some of our employment cost index data. But in general, we have been seeing pretty decent, pretty hefty wage increases for workers over the last couple of years. So now I'm going to transition to another survey that we have that can kind of show how the big picture of what's going on with the labor force and how that can impact wages as well. So this comes from our current population survey. This is part of the jobs report that comes out the first Friday of every month. And this is where we get all our demographic data. So we actually contract with the Census Bureau to collect this information. They visit households. They ask them various questions about their labor force status, and this is how we determine the headline numbers such as the unemployment rate. This comes from households. So from the business side, we're getting payroll number. We can't figure out number of unemployed people by asking businesses. We actually have to go to the household. So this is where we get our unemployment rate data and other labor force demographic data. Big picture in August 2024, the total civilian non-institutional population, right around 270 million. Of those, 161 million were employed, 7.1 million were unemployed, and then we have 100 million people not in the labor force. So a little bit of technical stuff, how BLS and people determine the unemployment rate. We can look at the bar on the right there. That's the labor force. So the labor force includes unemployed and employed people. In order to be considered unemployed, you have to have made an attempt to look for work within the past month. So if you have not made an attempt to look for work within the past month, you're considered not in the labor force. And there's a variety of reasons why people are not in the labor force. They could be retired, they could be in school, they could be taking care of family responsibilities. And that number was right around 95 million prior to the pandemic, so about 100 million now, but the population has increased as well. So that's kind of similar to what it was prior to the pandemic when you look at the population increase. But the unemployment rate, so look at a couple quick definitions here. The unemployment rate is the number of unemployed as a percent of the labor force. So it would be that 7.1 million divided by the number of unemployed, 161 plus the 7 million. So that's a little definition of how we calculate the unemployment rate, how we calculate the labor force participation rate, which has some very interesting things going on with it. The labor force participation rate is the total number of people in the labor force as a percent of the total population. So when you look at the unemployment rate, currently at 4.2% nationwide, this is down 0.1% over the month, but it's 0.4 percentage points higher than it was this time last year. So a lot of our charts, with pandemic really messed up a lot of our charts, throws off some of the kind of the scaling here, but obviously unemployment shot up for a couple months there during the pandemic. Unemployment rate was recovered. It actually got lower than it was prior to the pandemic, but it has been trending up of late. One thing that the unemployment rate can, the impact that unemployment can have on wages, if you have real low unemployment, that means there's not a lot of people even available, to possibly work if you wanted to hire them. So there's a lot more competition for workers when there's not a lot of unemployed people. As the number of unemployed increase, once again, that's going to increase the supply of labor. So that can actually help kind of decrease wages a bit. But we saw a period of very, very low unemployment, has been ticking up of late. So this will be something to keep an eye on going forward. Now, when we look at the labor force participation rate, this is another way to look at the available kind of labor pool. So this is a percent of the people who are either the number of unemployed or employed people as a percent of the population. This is a rate that has not recovered to what it was prior to the pandemic. So currently at about 62.7%, similar to last month, a little bit lower than this time last year. And so this is also a rate that has been kind of trending down over time, and I'll kind of explain why that's happening. But big picture, if you just looked at that headline number on the screen here, 62.7%. Oh, what's going on with labor force? Why aren't people wanting to work? When we drill down a little bit further and we look at actually the age groups, we can see some interesting things going on here. That middle group, that 25 to 54-year-old, that's what we call the prime working age. Majority of people working are within this age group. And that labor force participation rate actually has recovered from much higher than it was prior to the pandemic, and currently at about 84%. It's really that older group, that 55 years and older group. Their participation rate has not recovered from what it was prior to the pandemic. So I saw that huge drop there, as we did in all age groups, but for the 55 years and older, that has yet to recover, currently at 38.6%. So there can be a variety of reasons. Sometimes, maybe the kind of pandemic hit and older people said, oh, I'm just going to retire. I got enough money saved up. I'm not going to go back and re-enter the labor force. Could be other health concerns in there as well. One thing I would point out about that 55 years and older group, this is making up a larger and larger portion of the labor force. That kind of the baby boom generation has kind of moved its way through the labor force. They're in the retirement age now. So it's making up a larger and larger share of the total labor force with a lower labor force participation rate. So that's really what's been kind of holding down that overall labor force participation rate. And we'll get into that kind of aging labor force a little bit more when we talk about our employment projections. One last thing I'd like to point out about the labor force, we've really been seeing is the prime working age women. The bottom line there, 78.4%. This is the group that has really been seeing a big gains in labor force participation rate. That 78.4% is the highest labor force participation rate for prime working age women on record.
Matt, really quick, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Had a question from one of our attendees that says, what is the absolute number for each of those workforce cohorts? I think it might have been in regards to previous slide. Perfect.
Yeah, I didn't include the numbers on this one, but we can get you that. I can put a link in the chat or send that afterwards. And you might see we might see this as well on the employment projections. But yeah, there are definitely underlying numbers in thousands and millions behind these percentages as well. So didn't have that on here, but we do publish those, and I'm more than happy to get those to you. So great question. Anytime you see a rate, there are numbers behind that we can show you. But yeah, just wrapping up about the labor force participation rate for women at an all-time record high for prime working age women. So this is an interesting thing to look at. It could be due to a variety of factors. I mean, the labor force participation rate for women overall has been trending up over time, but maybe things like expanded telework has been allowing more people to enter the labor force. There's been lots of issues about childcare and making sure that's available to people. That can have a big impact. Possibly if people are able to telework, maybe they don't need to pay as much for child support, so they're able to do both. So very interesting thing to look at. And that labor force participation rate for men has been kind of holding steady. So it's really that labor force participation for women that has been helping bring up that overall number, which was 83.9% last month. So good news is for the prime working age, even though there's the bigger numeric number, the numeric number for the older workers has been going up. This prime working age, their participation rate is really, really healthy currently. Just drilling down while we're on the topic of unemployment, we'll look at unemployment rates by state. As of July, District of Columbia had the highest unemployment rate, 5.5%, followed by Nevada at 5.4% and California at 5.2%. Arizona, 3.4%. And Arizona was only one of two states that saw a decrease in their unemployment rate over the year. Arizona's unemployment rate fell 0.5 percentage points over the year. So we saw employment was kind of trending up nationwide. As of July, Arizona, little good news, it has their unemployment actually decreased over the year. And then I probably mentioned it a bunch, but tons of more data available on our website. This is a look at unemployment rates for the county level. We can get unemployment rates all the way down to the city level. So any city that has a population of 25,000 or more, BLS will publish an unemployment rate for. Kind of on the map on the right there, wide variety. We always say unemployment rate 4.2% nationwide, but every area has a different story going on. So in Arizona, highest unemployment rate was Pima County at 16%, and lowest was Greenlee County at 3.2%. You can see Pima there, and then you can also drill down to Tucson and the other cities and towns listed there as well. So this is something we update on a monthly basis, and it's available on our website. And just looking at some of the trends overall in unemployment rate, this is looking at the United States as well as Arizona, and then drilling down to Pima County. So unemployment rate a little bit lower lately, as the previous chart showed, in Arizona and Pima County, but has been ticking up as well the last couple months. So that's the red, orange and green line are the Arizona and Pima County trend together pretty nicely. If you go back to April 2020, you can see the unemployment rate spiked, got up to over 14% nationwide. Never got that high for Arizona and Pima County, but overall, pretty similar trend when compared to the U.S. So a lot of times people will ask, why should I care about these national numbers that come out? Well, they kind of tend to trend together with some of the local area data. So just keep that in mind. When you see national numbers, it could be kind of a trend that you could see roll down to the state and local areas in the future as well. Okay, so that covered our jobs report, current employment statistics, current population survey. One other thing when it comes to wages that can have an impact on wages and wage increases are number of job openings. So BLS produces on a monthly basis our job openings and labor turnover survey. We call it JOLTS, but job openings, labor turnover survey. And once again, we're surveying businesses to get this information. A lot of stuff going on this chart here, but I'll kind of break it down. I think it's a good representation of all the various data that the JOLTS program produces. The black line is the total number of job openings at the national level. So as of July, there were 7.7 million job openings nationwide. This number has been trending down, 1.1 million lower than it was this time last year. It really spiked up there coming out of the pandemic. We had record high in the number of job openings. So still a good, healthy amount of job openings out there, but it has been trending down. We also track total separations. So, and we can break that out into three different categories. The layoffs and discharges, quits, which is the blue bar, layoffs and discharges, the red bar, and then other separations makes a small portion of total separations, but these would be your like retiree people. But what I find interesting, and then the light blue line is the number of hires there. Anytime the light blue line is higher than the total separations, all the bars, that means the economy is adding jobs. One thing that obviously during all the shutdowns, and we saw layoffs and discharges spike. Coming out of that, we saw all these job openings. We had a lot of people that were kind of, maybe a little hesitant to come back off the sidelines, get back into the labor market for whatever reason. So there was a lot of competition for workers, a lot of job openings, a lot of competition to kind of get these workers for those industries that were looking to hire people. So workers had a lot of power, and that led to an increase in quits. We went through a period, you might have heard about it in the news, they kind of referenced it as the Great Resignation, a record high number of people quitting, represented by those blue bars. And people generally, they can quit for a variety of reasons, but generally quits can be an indication that workers, there's something out there that they're quitting for, another job that might pay more. They have, when the economy is kind of tight, people are less likely to quit. You'll see layoffs increase while quits kind of, stay the same. People don't feel as comfortable looking for a new job because they want to kind of hang on to the job they have, not sure what else is out there. But when you see all these job openings, you see people have like, oh, I can go find something better. And that kind of has a ripple effect of more competition and employers having to increase wages to attract those workers. So kind of the good news for employers, we have seen the quits kind of starting to curtail off there. Still, people are quitting at a high, more people are quitting that are getting laid off. But in general, we have seen number of quits starting to decrease with the number of job openings. So this is a trend to keep an eye on. Job openings continue to trend down. So we see these 7.7 million job openings. Where are they at? What industries are they in? So the JOLTS program can look, and this chart here shows the total number of job openings by major industry sectors. So currently the largest number of job openings are in professional and business services, as well as healthcare and social assistance, followed by leisure and hospitality. Those are represented by the blue bars, 1.5 million job openings in professional and business services, 1.4 million in healthcare and social assistance. The red line is what we call the job openings rate. So anytime you see a rate, it kind of levels the playing field because some of these industries are just very large industries to begin with. So they're going to have more job openings just because they're a larger industry. But when you look at the rate there, that's putting everybody at the same rate. So you can see, but once again, professional and business services and healthcare and social assistance have high rates as well. So these are still jobs that have a lot, still industries that have a lot of job openings, and wouldn't expect to necessarily see wages decrease as much in these industries as perhaps some of the other industries that have less job openings, less opportunities for workers to kind of jump ship and find something better in. Another product of the JOLTS is what we call the a little chart that kind of combines the number of job openings with the number of unemployed people. So we're getting data from two different surveys, our current population survey and our JOLTS survey. And we can look at the number of unemployed persons per job opening. As of July 2024, 0.9 unemployed persons per job opening. So another way to look at this, kind of hard when it gets below 1, but think of it as like 9 unemployed people for every 10 job openings. So anytime it's below 1, there's still more job openings than people able to fill them. So kind of gives workers a little bit more power as well. That number shot up during the pandemic, but it's pretty historically low, has been trending up of late, but we saw some very low numbers when this coming out of mid 2022. We can also look at the state level. Nationally, 0.8 as of June, because once again, this comes out a little bit later. So if at the state level in Arizona, 0.6 unemployed persons per job openings, or 6 unemployed persons for every 10 job openings. So Arizona is still well below 1. You can see California above 1.5%. So in that case, they have more unemployed persons than available job openings. So that's another thing that can have an impact on wages. We can also break down our JOLTS data, get it down to the state level. At the state level, we can't break it out into industries. There's not enough, the level of detail isn't large enough to do that. But we can just look at the big picture. I'll look at the job openings there, trending down once again in Arizona has been kind of going up and down a bit the last few months, a little volatile, but big picture has been trending down from its peak there in 2020, early 2022. And we can also look at layoffs and discharges versus quits at the state level. In June of 2024, in Arizona, there were 74,000 quits, while there were 43,000 layoffs and discharges. Over the last 12 months, quits averaged 81,000 per month, while layoffs and discharges averaged about 40,000 per month. So still seeing more quits, but they have been, kind of see trending down at the state level there too. That's the dark blue bar.
I have a quick question, Matt.
Sure.
What is the desired ratio on that, or is there a desired ratio?
That's a good question. I was tempted to put a chart, a graph, and kind of combine those and get that ratio. BLS, we kind of just report the numbers and let other people decide what a good ratio is and bad about it. But in general, from an employer's perspective, I think having, whenever you see a lot of people quitting, it can definitely add pressure to your business because you're either having to, pay more to attract workers, or just the time involved in retraining people. You hiring somebody new, when you have more people quitting, it can, kind of have an impact on your day-to-day operations. You're going to have to replace that person. You might have to pay the new person more, and you're going to have to train that person to get them up to speed. So I don't have off the top of my head, I wouldn't say what a good ratio is. But from an employer's perspective, I would, kind of say that from an employee's perspective, quits are great. That's going to have more power. There's lots of opportunities out there for them and all these job openings. But from an employer's perspective, I think when you see that kind of quits going down, it kind of had a little pressure off takes a little pressure off of having to think about people jumping ship as much.
That's true. All right, thanks.
Sure. A great question. Okay, so now we'll actually get into, I think I made it about 47 minutes without really getting into the wage data, but it's all about wages. So now we're actually going to start getting into some of the wages. So these data come from our quarterly census of employment and wages. We're going to start with industry data. So just let you know what's out there, because sometimes you'll hear these numbers and it's important to realize what they represent. So anytime you hear industry data, for example, these are the largest industries in Pima County ranked on total employment. So general, medical, and surgical hospitals has the largest total employment. This was as of first quarter 2024. You can see the number of establishments, the total employment, and then their average weekly wage. When we talk about industry employment, it is everybody within that industry. We're getting from employers, you're reporting your total wages and total employment, and we're just dividing the two to get doing some math with that to get average weekly wage. But it's capturing everybody within that industry. So you're going to have your CEO to the receptionist. Everybody is included in that. So keep that in mind when you look at industry wages. But just to let you know, you do have industry data at the county level. We can look at average weekly wages. We can look at total employment, total number of establishments for very, very detailed industry level. We classify, publish industries according to what we call the NAIC system, North American Industrial Classification System. And you can get wage data for down to the county level for industries down to the 6-digit NAICS level. Also included a little other column there on the right there, location quotient, which we'll get to on the next slide. But just to let you know, industry data are available down to the county level, down to detailed industries. If we looked at, ranking the same data by ranking it by average weekly wages, we can see some interesting things here. Some very high paying industries. Keep in mind, once again, kind of knowing some of the nuances of this particular wage data, it's capturing all wages, which would include things like bonuses, stock options. So sometimes you'll see wages, not everybody in the offices of other holding companies is making $13,000 a week, is basically the story I'm trying to say here. So keep that in mind when you're talking about looking at industry data from this particular data set, kind of know what we mean by wages. So this is total wages paid throughout the quarter. So keep that in mind. You can look at wage data. Just keep in mind what it's actually measuring. And then kind of wrapping up here, you can also look at what I call the what makes a county unique. In this case, we can look at what's called the location quotient. And this is basically measures the concentration of employment within a particular industry at the county level compared to the industry makeup at the national level. So if you have a location quotient above 1, it means that you have a higher concentration of that particular industry in your county as opposed to the rest of the country. So I just find this interesting. Kind of shows what makes your area unique, and if something were to maybe happen in a particular industry, it might have more of an impact on your area than another area. So I always throw in like the example of like Las Vegas. If something happened with the pandemic happened and they're very big into leisure and hospitality, that can have a much bigger impact on their area than an area that doesn't have a big concentration of leisure and hospitality jobs. So that is our QCW data when it comes to wages. QCW also allows us to break data down into size classes. So I just like to just show this. It's especially for the small businesses out there. The bottom chart there, that is the established number of establishments broken out by size class. So if we were to add up all the bars up to the green bars, so every establishment that has less than 100 employers, those establishments make up 90% of all establishments in the state. So when you talk about small business being the backbone of the economy, this is a just great illustrative example here. It makes up 98%. Companies that have less than 100 employees make up 90% of all establishments. Above that, we see the total employment. And if we were to add up those bars, similar format, we would see that establishments that have less than 100 employees make up close to 50% of all employment as well. So the majority of establishments and also half of about half of all employment. So big impact when it comes to small businesses and the role they play in the economy. I always think that's interesting to look at. We can also break it down QCW and look at wages by size class. Just interesting trend here. The larger the companies get, with the exception of fewer than 5, wages tend to go up as the establishments get bigger. So I always find that interesting. And a lot of that can have to do with the type of industries that make up those establishments as well. Some of the smaller establishments might be industries that typically don't pay as much to begin with. But just to let you know, wage size class data are available at the state level. If you're interested in accessing this detailed industry data, here's a link. I can make these slides available too, Frank, if anybody wants them afterwards.
Thank you. Yes, we did get a request.
Oh, perfect. So this is going to move on to our occupational wage data. Now, this is what I consider I would just quickly to go back to the industry data, the QCW data. That is census data. It's not survey data. So every employer who files state unemployment insurance has to, on a quarterly basis, and some of you might do this yourselves, report to your state workforce agency your quarterly report that has your total employment, your industry, your NAICS, total employment, total wages. So that's how we're able to publish that really detailed industry data. And that data set is important for a couple of reasons. It allows us to see the really detailed data down to the county level, but it also serves as the universe for all of BLS's sample surveys. So we're able to find out, all the industries across the country, their establishment size, what their NAICS code is. And then when we do sample surveys, we're able to make sure when we construct the surveys, we're going to be able to make sure that every industry, every size class, every geographic area is properly represented in our survey. So that's another key role that those data play. So we use that data to create our universe for what's called our occupational employment and wage statistics survey. So the QCW is kind of the gold mine when it comes to industry data. And I consider this, our occupational employment and wage statistics, the gold mine when it comes to occupational data. So all that industry data was focused on industry as a whole. And now we're finally getting into the detailed occupational data. Big picture when it comes to our OEWS data, Arizona 3031 is the average hourly rate, and just slightly below the U.S. average. The U.S. average was 3148. You can see the West Coast states there a little bit higher, the darker blue. And another thing that we can do with our OEWS data is kind of compare different areas. So we see the table on the right there, average hourly wage in Arizona, 3031, Tucson, 2860. You can compare that to the different metropolitan areas in Arizona as well. Once again, metropolitan areas consist of one or more counties. Tucson consists strictly of Pima County. Phoenix, for example, you can see the purple there, 3120 for both. Phoenix Metro consists of Maricopa and Pinal County. So just something to keep in mind when you're talking about metropolitan areas. We publish these data once a year. So it's very detailed occupational data. So it does take some time to compile. So 2023 are the latest data published. I'm going to show you right after we go through this, our employment cost index, which is often used to age survey data. So keep that in mind. We can look at our OEWS data allows us to look at employment by occupational group. So if we look at total employment in the Tucson area, you can see that the majority of jobs are within the office administrative support and food prep and serving related occupations, but you can see the other occupational groups there as well. So speaking strictly of occupational groups, before we start working our way down, management occupational group was the highest paid in the Tucson area, averaging $57.65 an hour, followed by legal and healthcare practitioners and technical occupations. All these on this chart here were above the Tucson average of $28.32. Some of the lower paying occupational groups are shown on this chart here. Protective service down to building and grounds cleaning, and maintenance occupations, healthcare support as well, below the Tucson average of 2860. And we can look at the most common occupations in Tucson. The yellow bars represent the total number of employed in that particular occupation. So we're finally getting down to the detailed occupations here. The most common occupation in the Tucson area, fast food and counter workers, about over 13,000 in that particular occupation. Their average hourly rate was $14.99. Second most common, general operations managers, and then home health and personal care aides. This is an occupation that we've really seen employment increase over time. A lot of it has to do with the aging population, more people living longer, wanting to live in their homes longer. So we have been seeing a big increase in that occupation, the third most common in the Tucson area. But as you can see, the most common occupations typically, don't pay. They all pretty much pay below the average of all occupations within the area, with the exception of registered nurses and general and operations managers. And then just an example of the highest paying occupations in the Tucson area, probably not surprising. A lot of them are in the medical care industry. But we have occupational data for over 800 occupations. So we're just on this presentation, I'm just highlighting a few, but we have wage data for over 800 occupations. So you can go to our website, look at the Tucson area, find a detailed occupation, what's the average rate for a software developer in the Tucson area. And you can get detailed information on the total number of employed people in that occupation, as well as their pay rates. Kind of tying it back in with we talked about the QCW and the location quotient, what makes an area unique when it comes to industries. This is just another kind of fun chart showing what occupations are most unique in Tucson, as compared to the national average. So this is just based on location quotient. You can kind of see some of the jobs that have a higher concentration of employment locally compared to the national average. Got a couple solar installers, a couple gambling industry ones there as well. Okay, so what I like to highlight with our OEWS data is, yes, we published average hourly wages for over 800 occupations in over 400 metropolitan areas across the country, but we can also look at pay ranges. And I think this is where, having that average hourly wage kind of gets a good benchmark. This is what the average worker in this occupation is making in my area, but you can also break it down and look at percentile data. With the percentile data, how to interpret this is, let's just take software developers in Tucson as an example, as the bars on the left there. The median, 53.51, that's the kind of the midpoint. That means that half of all software developers make less than 53.51 and half make more. 10% make 41.31 or less, and 90% make more than that. And then, for example, the 90th percentile, 87.27, that means that 90% of software developers in Tucson make less than that, 10% make more. So sometimes employers will look at this and, great, I know what the average rate is, but I'm hiring somebody in entry-level position, brand new worker for this occupation. Having this percentile data can help kind of get a pay range and say, like, maybe when they're starting out, put them a little lower toward the pay range than the higher end. So it adds a little more depth to the level of just as compared to the average hourly wage. So I always like to showcase this. It also just goes to show that there is a lot of variance within occupations. So we have this, once again, percentile data for all the occupations, 800 occupations as well. And then kind of sticking with the software developer theme here, you can compare a particular occupation in your area and compare it to other areas across the state or across the country. So here's an example. If we look at Tucson, software developers, there's 5,460. The average hourly wage is $60.46. The median midpoint, $53.51. And you can see how that compares to the rest of the state. So if you're trying to compete with a neighboring county for a particular occupation, you can kind of have an idea of what the market rate for that job is in that area as well. And finally, sticking with software developers again, we have this data available at the national level. We don't have it down to the Tucson area level, but you can look at a particular occupation and see how the pay varies depending on what industry that occupation is working in. So, for example, here, software developers working in the web search portal industry make over $100 an hour, while in the computer and electronic product manufacturing industry, $75 an hour. So it can be even different pay within different industries depending on the occupation. For example, even like a secretary at say a secretary at a small shop compared to a Fortune 500 company, the average rate might be different. So looking at the industry data, occupational data by industry can be another way to kind of get an idea of how pay may vary between industries. So once again, this is probably our most popular data set among HR people. We get tons of requests. I know a lot of companies, they do like their own private salary surveys. Maybe they pay a company that's really going to do a survey specific to their industry or specific to their area, and they're great. I always like to say having more data is better. Never hurts to have more numbers to bounce off each other. Our data are publicly available. All our publication and methodology is published on our website, so we don't have any agenda. We simply collect the data, report the data. It's always good to have more options. So if you're interested in this, multiple ways to find on our website. We have a database you can access and pull up quick reports. And we also have on the left-hand side there some pre-created tables. You can click on like the metropolitan area link and it would take you directly to a page that has all the occupations in Tucson and their employment and wage data for all those 800 occupations as well. So as I mentioned, this is OEWS data are published once a year, and lots can change over time, especially coming out of this pandemic. We were seeing wage increases going at a pretty rapid rate. So I always like to show people whenever I talk about wage data, we like to talk about our employment cost index. An issue with OEWS and maybe some wage surveys that you are using is the data might seem a little old. Even 2023 is not that long ago, but things can change at a rapid pace. So the employment cost index is a tool that you can use to help age survey data, help age wage data. A little bit of background about the ECI. Once again, we're surveying businesses. We have people out in the field who are going to companies on a quarterly basis, tracking how wages are changing, getting a real-time feel for how wages and labor compensation costs are changing from the employer's perspective. The great thing about the ECI, not only does it track changes in wages, but it tracks changes in total compensation, wages plus benefits. So typically wages make up about 70% of total compensation, with benefit costs making up the other 30%. So ECI captures total compensation, and then we can break it down into wages and benefit costs and see how those are changing. So as I mentioned, tracks wages, and then we're capturing benefit costs. We have 18 different benefits that we collect data on: health insurance, paid time off, sick leave, workers' comp. See how all those costs are changing over time when we package that into the employment cost index. Big picture on how the ECI has been changing as of late. So if we look at this, we can see the yellow line is the total compensation costs. Those costs increased 4.1% over the year. If we look specifically at the wage portion of it, wages up 4.2% over the year. Still pretty good, hefty increases. You have to go all the way back to the early 80s to see the ECI increasing at this high of a rate. So it peaked at over 5% in 2022. Employer costs were going up, over 5% a year just for labor compensation. Has been trending down And a lot of this kind of has to do with some of the things we've touched on before, with job openings decreasing, total employment kind of decreasing, unemployment ticking up a bit. So overall, wage increases have been coming down, but once again, they're still, above 4%, which is, historically still rather high. And just to go back to this. So if we say that 4.2% or 4.2%, wages have increased 4.2% over the year, just to kind of tie it in with the OEWS data. So you could take that OEWS data from last year and say the average rate for, software developer was X. All you'd have to do to get a rough estimate of what that rate might be now, just times it by 4.2%. So increase that average hourly rate by 4.2%, you can get an idea of what the going rate for a particular occupation might be currently. But overall, even within that headline number, wages up 4.2% for all workers. Can be a different story depending on what industry you're looking at. In this case, we're going to look at private industry versus state and local government workers. So private industry, their wage increases have been slowing down, currently at 4.1%, while within state and local government workers, their increases have still starting to peak up at 5.1% over the year. You can also break that down and look at union versus non-union. If you have any union contracts, this could be useful. A lot of companies will use BLS data as part of their contract negotiations. Perhaps, we're going to raise our wages once a year, either based on the CPI, the cost of living, or based on the ECI, how much wages or labor costs are increasing. So BLS publishes, non-biased data that employers can use to help with their negotiations if interested. Big picture here on this one, we've seen a large increase in the last couple of years in union wages. Latest number as of June 2024, union workers, private industry union workers, their wages have increased 6.5% over the year. And then we can break it down by industry. Transportation and warehousing industry saw the largest over the year increase in wages, over 8% over the year. Some of this is tied with kind of the previous slide with unions. So some of the union contracts you might have heard in the news, different negotiations, and some of those were concentrated in the transportation and warehousing industry. But big picture is that we have data available down to the industry level for the employment cost index. One thing I like to point out is, industry trends. So kind of coming back to the job openings and coming out of the pandemic, the leisure and the hospitality sector was a sector that was really impacted. We saw huge increases in wages, with employers having to pay more to attract workers to help fill positions to get people back off the sidelines. So we were seeing increases about 9% over the year in the leisure and the hospitality industry. That has cooled off a bit. Now we're seeing transportation warehousing industry go up. So very interesting kind of ways you can slice and dice the data to get a picture of what's going on in your particular industry. You can also look at occupational group data. In this case, instead of looking at industry data, we're looking at occupational groups. Once again, the transportation, material moving occupations saw an increase in about 6% over the year in wages. So say you were interested in using the employment cost index, what's going on with labor costs in my area. So BLS would love to publish an employment cost index or all our data for every single city, every single locality across the entire country. Of course, labor budget constraints and workforce constraints, we're not able to collect data from every single area and publish it every single month. So we do publish ECI data for 4 metropolitan areas in the West region. We do one for Phoenix, but we don't have one for Tucson. So by definition, you'd have to go to kind of the broader geographic area. So by definition, Tucson would be represented in some of our geographic indexes, such as the Mountain Division, the West Division, or the overall U.S. city average, which is to all private industry workers. I'll go through this a little quickly, but wages, as I mentioned, only part of the story. If you're interested in benefit data, benefit cost data, we publish our employer cost for employee compensation survey. This is a quarterly survey that tracks compensation costs and gives dollar amounts. So previously somebody had asked, do you have like the actual, numbers behind this percent change? In this case is another example of the ECI measures change in labor cost, percent changes in labor cost, while the EC actually gives the dollar amounts. Majority of benefits, you can see here the different categories we collect. Legally required benefits make up about 7.7% of total compensation, but we do have data we basically capture data on all these various benefits shown on the screen here. And then we can break it down and look at compensation amounts by dollar amount and percent amount. So I'll briefly explain this one. This is a big picture. Total compensation for all private industry workers averaged $43.94 an hour. Of that, wages and salaries, $30.90 an hour, which makes up 70.3% of total compensation. It can be a different story when you look at different industries. For example, within the leisure and hospitality industry, wages and salaries make up over 80% of total compensation, while total benefits costs from an employer's perspective make up less than 20%. So an industry like that probably has more part-time workers in it, maybe less benefits offered to part-time workers, so their total compensation cost when it comes to benefits make up a smaller piece of the pie. But then you can break it down, and just once again, this is an example using the leisure and hospitality industry, and you can look at some of the different benefit categories. On average, employers pay 7.5% of total compensation costs toward paid leave, 4% for supplemental pay, 7.4% for insurance, 3.5% for retirement, and 7.3% for legally required benefits. I always encourage people, if you're going to use EC data, the percent data are a little better tool in my opinion. Dollar amounts can vary widely depending on what the occupation was, what the industry is. But if you can say, on average, the average worker in this industry, the employer is paying 3.2% of their total compensation costs in leisure and hospitality go toward paid leave. And then you can take that percent and compare it to your particular wage data you have to figure out what that dollar amount might be for your particular occupation. So I covered a lot of stuff when it comes to pay and benefits. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's our job to help people find this. So we do have a website kind of categorized here. You can see the different categories under the pay and benefits. Tons of data. If you have any trouble finding detailed data, don't hesitate to reach out to us. So one other final thing when it comes to inflation that employers often use, and this comes, I'm not sure how many of you use this, but when it comes to contracts, or maybe you want to give your employee a raise and an annual cost of living increase, some people choose to use the consumer price index to kind of a gauge on, how much is the cost of living increase? Maybe I'll try to replicate that and give a comparable increase in wages to my staff. So as I mentioned, some people like to use that. Some people like to use the ECI. I like the ECI in the fact that it's specifically looking at labor cost. The CPI is measuring inflation from the consumer's perspective rather than the employer's perspective. But big picture, the CPI, just to kind of quickly talk about it here, measures a variety of things. It measures how much consumers are spending on housing, on transportation. So we can look at how much gas prices are increasing, how much electricity prices are increasing, how much their college tuition increasing. So depending on, we're capturing a total market basket of goods and services and seeing how those prices are changing over time. CPI really spiked, as mentioned there, has been cooling off. A lot of the recent, kind of what's keeping it up of late, housing costs. Housing costs have increased. The housing index increased 4.4% over the year. You can see some other indexes such as transportation has actually decreased over the year. So lots of things feed into the CPI, but the overall number, inflation up 2.5% over the year, much lower than it was, back in 2022 when it got over 9%. We don't publish the CPI for Tucson, but if you were interested in using CPI data for the Tucson area, you once again need to have to go to the larger geographic region. We publish one for the Mountain Division. We publish the CPI for the West region. And we also publish CPI data by size class. Size class BC represents all areas with the 2.5 million population or less. So Tucson would be represented in that index as well. But overall, they tend to trend together pretty nicely over time. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I don't want to definitely want to leave time for questions. We can go into some projections data, Frank, if you're interested. But I definitely wanted to leave time for some questions.
I would love, we've got about 10 minutes. So yeah, if there's any questions, and if we don't get a lot of questions, then for sure you can come into this. But yeah, let's open it up to our attendees for questions. And attendees, you can come off of your mic. You don't have to put it in the chat box. If you got a direct question, just go ahead and say it into your microphone.
Was everybody pretty familiar with BLS before I started talking, or any idea what we did, or no?
No, I mean, I was familiar with it, but the level of details, no clue.
So yeah, I think a lot of people that I always like to, whenever I talk to businesses, so we're getting this data from businesses. So it's nice to know what ends up happening with the data once it gets reported. Some people will either, and just how we get this data. You hear about it in the news all the time, and to kind of have an idea, be able to kind of maybe talk to your staff or talk to your boss about what's going on in the economy, just general questions, trends that might be going on when you hear about it in the news. It's nice to have a little better perspective on what's really going on. People always want information they can trust, and there's so much information out there these days. People always don't know what they can't trust. BLS, we don't have an agenda, we're nonpartisan, we simply report the numbers, and then people report on them in different ways. But it's always nice to be able to okay, let me make sure, let me double check that. And you can come to us and go to our website and see the actual numbers themselves.
Great. Well, I'm not hearing any questions, but by all means, you can jump in and interrupt me if there are. But Matt, why don't you go ahead and just go through these projections? I'm sure that the folks want to see that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, this is, especially if you're ever working with, workforce development, or maybe you have some children who are trying to kind of decide what career they want to go into, or just in general, you want to see how your industry might be changing over the next decade. On an annual basis, BLS publishes 10-year employment projections. And let's see, a lot of different things feed into how we project the labor market to change over time, how we project employment to increase, what occupations will increase over time. We look at a bunch of different things. One of them is the changing demographics. I always find this chart, I've been doing this talk for a long time, and this chart gets updated every year, but it's still the same story. I've kind of seen how this age group has been progressing through the labor force. So basically, the labor force, we're seeing a larger portion in that older age group. So when it comes to labor force 65 and older, back in 2003, those 65 and older made up 3.2% of the labor force. And as of 2033, we're projecting 8.6%. So you're going to have, kind of that cohort, baby boom cohort, moved through the entire labor force over the year, to the whole labor market over the year, and into that older range now. So there's going to be an opportunity for different things are going to impact these overall projections. One of them is the available workforce, and some of that available workforce is going to be a bit older. And some of the things that the population is going to be older as well. So that feeds into some of what the projections we do, and what jobs are going to be in demand over the next 10 years. One of them is healthcare support occupations. Healthcare support occupations are projected to increase by 15.2% over the decade. Overall, total employment is projected to increase 4% over the decade. So as I mentioned before, people living longer, maybe more healthcare issues, more need to care for older population. So healthcare support occupations is going to have the largest increase, followed by computer and mathematical occupations. Those occupations expected to increase close to 13% over the decade. We do see some occupational groups that are expected to decline over the next decade. Biggest one there, office and administrative support. A lot of this will have to do simply with things like automation. More things are being automated. AI comes along, less need for manual type of office and administrative support occupations. More things can be done via computer. So that's an occupational group that we see are projected to see a decrease over the next decade. Big picture when it comes to our employment projections, we can look at percent change or numeric change over the time. So this goes back to the numeric versus percent. When it comes to the percent increase, the occupation that we're projecting to have the largest percent increase over the decade is actually wind turbine service technicians. Employment projected increase 60%. But as you can see by the green bar, that's only 6.8 thousand jobs over the next decade. So always something to keep in mind when you see some of these headline numbers. Oh, it's going to increase 50% over the next decade. Everybody should go and become the wind turbine technician. Well, that's great, but there's only going to be 7,000 available jobs, new jobs created over that time period. So always keep that in mind when you talk about percent and numeric changes. When it comes to numeric changes, home health and personal care aides is projected to add the most new jobs over the next decade, followed by software developers. So you can also tie that in with wage data. So home health and personal care aides, tons of jobs going to be available, but the pay is not going to be, it's going to be below the national average. Average pay as of May 2023 for that occupation, only 33,000. And you can see the pay ranges for other occupations as well there. But software developers, cooks, registered nurses have a few higher paying occupations there mixed in with those groups. Talking about declining occupations, kind of ties in. A lot of these are your office and administrative support occupations. Word processors, typists, projected to decline 38% over the decade. And when it comes to numeric losses, cashiers are projected to lose the most jobs numerically over the next decade, 353,000. So I'm going to go through these quickly, but just keep in mind, we'll make these slides available. So we talked about, some of these jobs, they're going to be declining. Cashiers are going to be declining. Nobody should ever go into that field. That's, long term, yes, that will be a declining occupation, but we can look at occupational openings. So a job like a cashier, retail sales, a lot of these, they have constant turnover. So sometimes these occupations, they may be a stepping stone to move on to a different occupation. So even though overall employment is going to decrease over the next decade, there's still going to be a need to fill these occupations due to people either leaving that occupation or exiting the labor force completely, retiring, or just exiting for other reasons. So we can look at employment growth and look at the number of job openings. So this is an example looking at fast food and counter workers. You're going to have close to, on an annual basis, close to 890,000 people leaving that occupation on an annual basis due to either moving on to another occupation or leaving the labor force. So when you add that, the need to fill those occupations along with the net employment change, on an annual basis, there's going to be a need for 912,000 fast food and counter workers. So even though these occupations might be decreasing, just keep in mind there's still going to be opportunities to work even in the declining occupations. And when we look at the occupations projected to have the most occupational openings on an annual basis, once again, your fast food and counter workers is going to have the most, over 900,000. You can also see home health care aides popping up again, cashiers. So a lot of these are jobs that will have possibly could have a decline, but there's still going to be a need to fill those occupations. So I always like to show this, especially for people working with workforce development, that there's still going to be a need to train people for particular occupations, even though there might be a decrease over time.
Matt, really quick, we have about 2.5 minutes left, so I just wanted to let you know.
Perfect. So I will wrap it up. We thank you for your time, and we cannot produce any of this information without the business community. So I just really wanted to emphasize that we try to give things back, showcase the data that we have that we get from you guys. Take advantage of it. If you need data, take advantage of us. We're here to help. Lots of numbers out there. Feel free to contact us at any time. More than happy to assist. And if you need any future presentations for a particular organization, we're happy to do that as well. So appreciate your time, taking some time out of your busy day to join me. And minute left for any questions.
Looks like people are signing off, Matt. So I really just want to say appreciate you, appreciate the time, and the people who are remaining on the call. We will be getting the slides out to you, so I have tracked attendance. Make sure that I get that information to you. But thank you so much, Matt, for the information. This was really great. So I'm certain that I'll be reaching out to you again for some future things that we can work on together.
Awesome. Anytime. Appreciate it.
Great. And this is being recorded, so this will be on our YouTube channel as well. But have a great day. Good seeing you, Kristen, and everybody else. Thank you.
Nice seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.